One of the most intimidating things for new photographers is the overwhelming amount of unfamiliar icons. So I want to walk you through what each of these icons mean. And I also want to demonstrate the importance of being comfortable with the info button. If you don't have your camera, pause the video, grab your camera in hand, and follow along as I'm doing this. All I want you to do is to press the information button. And you can see that we're toggling through several different kinds of screens. One of those screens doesn't have any icons at all. It's kind of stress reducing, right? Nothing to worry about. We have this black screen that has tons of icons. We can't see what we're shooting. Very useful for changing your camera settings in certain situations. Then we kind of have this medium hybrid that has icons. Not a lot of them. We can still see what we're shooting, but we can also change things. When you see this little gray box around it, that means we can touch that item and we can adjust it directly. We'll come back to that in a minute. Then we get these two columns on the left and right side with tons of different icons. This screen includes a histogram. This histogram is telling us how bright the image is. It is a statistical tool. And you'll notice that when you have the peak in the middle, that means we're exposed properly. There's a lot to go into. I have a free lesson on this on the crash course that will go into far greater depth. And then you'll notice this line here. There's two sets of lines, kind of hard to see. One set deals with up and down. I'm pointing the camera down, and you can see these little tick marks are red. And as I bring it back up, now they're green. And I'm right on the point of when I'm just pushing the camera just a little bit. This is telling me that the camera is level. It's a very useful tool for landscape shooters to have it built in. It was not always this way. And then you can see that we're starting over again. So with this in mind, I want to introduce you to these icons. And I think I'm going to do it here because this is easier to see. I like to shoot from the back of the camera in a way that you understand and you can see these icons very easily. I'm going to turn the camera, the mode dial up here, to M, to the manual mode, so we can see some of these other indicators. These numbers here, this one given as a fraction is your shutter speed. In this case, it is 1/125th of a second, and anything with an F refers to the aperture. The aperture is the size of your lens opening, and this is what controls the amount of light coming into the camera. The time, how long the shutter is open, and how wide the lens is open. Those two things control exposure. Exposure is another way of saying the amount of light. So by manipulating those two variables, we can change how much light is coming into the camera. And I will be pointing this out later on in these lessons. But you will see these indicators in many different places. Fractions are shutter speeds. Anything with an F deals with the aperture, the size of the lens opening. Commit those two things to memory. And in this case, it's also telling us which controls will change those settings. In this case, the primary selector. And in the case of the aperture, the secondary selector for manual mode, right? Now we also have this other setting here called ISO. ISO, currently it's set to auto. ISO deals with the amount of boost that the sensor gets. So it's a kind of a way of cheating. When we had film cameras, there were different types of film sensitivities. You could buy very sensitive film or less sensitive film, depending if you were shooting, in darker conditions or during midday. And digital cameras have simplified this by putting it into the camera, building it into the camera in such a way that it's really easy to change and adjust. And that is ISO. ISO controls the sensor boost. And let me demonstrate it right now since we're talking about it. I wasn't planning on this. The button I pushed there is the Q button. I'm pushing the Q button because it'll allow me to change these things. If I don't push it, I can't change them. There's also a Q button here in the bottom left-hand corner. And when I push that Q button, I can also change these settings. Something you'll notice is that we have the words auto right there. The auto means is the camera will determine the ISO, and it'll increase it or decrease it depending on what it wants to do. I am not a huge fan of that. I like having control, but there are some times I use it. So I'm going to change this to the number it had on there. It was 1250. And I'm going to take a picture. I'm going to come out to the regular screen. I'm going to focus on those blinds, and I'm going to take a picture. Now, an ISO of 1250 is not that high. And when we zoom in on the blinds, you can see it's pretty clean. Nice straight line. You can see even some scratch marks, some dust on the blinds, right? Look how clean that is. Now what I want to demonstrate is when we use a very high ISO. I'm going to turn this way up. I'm going to turn it up as high as it'll go. You can see that it's obviously overexposed. Overexposed means it's too bright. So what I'm going to do is use a faster shutter speed. A faster shutter speed is going to let in less light. So I have less light, high ISO. I'm going to take a picture just to demonstrate the trade-off of ISO. And I'm going to zoom in on this picture. Just touching here. And this is how you can inspect images, is like you would on a phone. You could pinch your fingers out. And if you look at the line here, you'll notice that this is a very grainy image. There's a lot of salt and pepper here. It's everywhere. And that's the trade-off with ISO, is that high ISOs will give you a much greater sensor boost. However, they're also going to introduce a lot of grain that is not pleasing to the eye. Lower ISOs will have less grain, but you also need a lot more light. We'll be talking about this more in the exposure lesson. I do this just for demonstration if you're a pure beginner and you want to know what ISO is and what it is doing. All that said, I'm going to turn this back to this about the setting we had it on. The ISO performance that I've seen out of the R7 so far, it's pretty amazing. I'm pretty impressed with it, with everything I've seen. Kind of gotten off track here. I'm going to come back to this black screen. In any event, these three settings, your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO, these are the most three important settings on your camera. You will see something similar when you look through the viewfinder. It'll be on the bottom of the viewfinder, the bottom of the screen there, and you should always be aware of what those settings are and where they're at when you are shooting. Just take a quick sneak peek kind of thing. Don't worry about manual for now. I'm going to give you some other instructions until you get there. Let's go through the rest of these icons so you know what they are and what they do. In the top left-hand corner, we have our shooting mode indicator. And as I rotate the mode dial, you will see different letters appearing. And some of our options are disappearing as we do this. I'll be discussing each of these modes in depth a little later, but this is where the mode that you're shooting in is found. Let's come back to manual. This guy right here is our exposure compensation bracket. And this is how we can make the images brighter or darker in certain modes. And I'll show you how to do that. This guy right here is our picture styles. Picture styles is sort of like a recipe that the camera uses to create different looks. For example, let's just turn this on and take a look real quick. You have all these different settings in there, and there's different names: auto, standard, portrait, landscape. Let's say I'm shooting a landscape shot. The picture style here will tend to oversaturate the blues to make your skies more blue than they probably really are. In the portrait picture style, the flesh tones might be more accurate. This is the idea of picture styles, and they have all these different user sets. We can come in and customize this depending on our wants, adjusting the sharpness, the contrast. It's a lot of information. If you're a pure beginner, I would say don't worry about it so much and leave it on auto for now. Next to that, we have our white balance. I'll be talking about these in depth. This is where we can change our white balance control. Then we have our white balance shift and bracket. Next, we have our auto light optimizer. We have our Wi-Fi settings. We have our card settings. You can see that we have both memory cards in there. And you'll notice that to the right of that, we even have the quality of our images, whether it's JPEG, RAW, compressed RAW, that should be indicated to the right of it. There's different ways to set up the cards. So you can record RAW to one memory card or JPEG to the other, or duplicates in both, or maybe video to one. This is in the deep menu section. On the bottom, we have our focusing clusters. This tells the camera in what area of the frame to look. Our focusing modes tell the camera when to focus, if it's a one shot or a continuous focus. Then we have our metering modes. This is how the camera measures light coming into the camera. We have our drive modes, which tell the camera how to behave after we push a shutter button down. Maybe we want a timer, maybe we want multiple bursts. And by the way, on any of these, you can push the set button again and it will open the menu. Select it, or we can double tap. So there's different ways to get to these controls. We have our Q button, we talked about. We have our battery life indicator. We have our Wi-Fi indicator. We have our image stabilization icon. These two numbers here on the bottom deal with the number of shots remaining. The one in the brackets deal with how many images can we get onto this memory card. The number next to it is the buffer depth, which means that if we're shooting continuous buffer, fast, rapid shooting, 15 frames per second, the camera is going to let us take, it says here, 65 images before it starts to slow down. Take this number here with a grain of salt because it can be a little variable depending on the size of the files, the burst mode that we're using, as well as the memory card speed that we have. Even if you put a different, a faster or slower memory card, usually it's going to stay about the same depending on, what settings you have. But when you're actually shooting, you might see something different. This guy right here deals with the custom setup of the camera buttons. So if we come in here and we tap that, we can customize our buttons, and we will customize some things a little later. You can see here that it gives you a white highlight on any button that you want to change. And there's tons of options when we say, let's say we want to change the depth of field preview button. The auto light optimizer allows us to adjust how the camera is tweaking certain things like contrast to a degree for JPEG images. I usually leave mine turned off. This guy right here is your flash exposure compensation. This essentially allows us to tell a flash to be a little bit brighter or darker. I cover this on the R7 crash course, and I'll demonstrate it in those lessons. For those of you coming from previous Canon systems and you're not familiar with this little ball with these lines coming off, that is your tracking frame. So when we come in here and we select this, by toggling the info button, we can make the tracking frame displayed or not displayed. I'll be giving you some demonstrations on that later. Now, there's a reason why I like starting here, is because as we start toggling through these other screens, you're going to recognize most of the symbols that we've already covered. So if I push the info button, look on the bottom here. Fraction, shutter speed, f, aperture, and then we have our ISO over here. So you know what those three things are already. This is our exposure compensation bracket. I haven't demonstrated what it does yet, but I will. Up here at the top, we have our mode, number of shots remaining, number of shots in the bursts. This new information here, hours, minutes, seconds, this is the amount of video that we can record onto our memory card for the current video settings. Then we have the battery icon, image stabilization, and our Q button. Anything with gray, we can push and adjust the setting directly. We also have the focal length of the lens that I have. This is a 24 to 105, and as I rotate it, you can see the focal length number changing. This is very nice. This magnifying glass will allow us to zoom in. There's some techniques I'll be demonstrating. One touch is ×5, another is ×10. You can focus using that. And we also have a touch shutter over here. I never use it because it drives me crazy, but the idea is you would touch, it would focus on the area that you touch, and it would automatically take a picture if it gets focus lock. So this is this hybrid screen. Now, when the auto shutter is turned off and we touch on the screen, this will allow us to focus touching on the screen. It's very nice. It's very fast and easy for many types of shooting. Let's push the info button again. Now we get to this intimidating screen that has all of these different icons on either side, right? Keep going through. Most of these we know already, but let's take a look. We're going to press the Q button to access them. This screen can be really confusing because there's just icons everywhere. The idea is that you have two columns, one on the far left, one on the far right. When you activate this screen, we can touch any of these options, or we can navigate with our directional pad or joystick. We can also just tap and it'll take us there. And then we get the options on the bottom of the screen. So depending on what feature we're changing, whether it's white balance, here are the white balance items. If it's our focusing modes, they're on the bottom. If it's our drive modes, they're on the bottom. So that's how this interface works. We get our categories on either side and our options on the bottom. And you know most of these already. Up at the top, we have our focusing clusters. It's our focusing modes between one shot and servo. I'll demonstrate these later. We have the cards that we're using, including image quality. So we can change whether we're shooting raw or, so if we push, and it's showing us the cluster button there. So if we push the cluster button, we can select whether we want to shoot raw or compressed raw. I'll explain those differences later if we wanted a quick change. And we could also change which memory card we're recording to by pressing info. So it's giving us these little extra instructions here. If we continue to go down, we have our drive modes, and we get all of the drive mode options here on the bottom. I'll take you through those a little bit later. We have our metering modes. Over here, we have our subject detection, whether it's human, animals, cars. We can change it to spot detection, turn it on or off. Usually have mine on people. The creative filters are basically gimmicky sets of colorization and posterization and things that are just, here's a soft focus, here's a fisheye effect. These are not professional tools, and I never use them. Here we have our picture styles. We went through this already. Here's our white balance. We already showed you this icon before. And then we have our flicker, anti-flicker shooting, which deals with certain sodium-based lamps outside. When you're shooting in a situation where lights are flickering so fast that we can't see it, the camera can detect it and shoot between those flickers so they're more consistent looking. I just leave it turned off for now. If you notice the difference, like if you're shooting out at a racetrack at night, you'll see color changes. That's when you'd want to turn it on. Mine's off, and this return arrow will return us to the main menu. All of the other icons in here we have already seen. We've seen them in other places. I know it's a lot of information. Pushing the info button again, we're brought back to the level screen and the histogram screen. There is another mode that has even more icons, and we're going to get to that by rotating the switch here from stills to video. So in the video mode, you'll notice that we have several new icons. We still have our shutter speed, aperture, ISO. You'll always see that pretty much any camera mode shooting that you're shooting with. In the top left-hand corner, we have the video camera icon with the M for manual mode, the amount of time remaining in our battery life. This guy here with the left and right, the L and the R, you can notice these levels. This is our audio gain. It's coming in through the microphone here. And by default, this should be on auto gain, which is going to fluctuate the intensity of your audio depending on if you're speaking or not speaking. It'll really mess things up. And there's a way to turn this off that I will demonstrate to put it under control and put it at a stable level. As we navigate through these, I'm going to push the Q button so you can see the title for these at least. Here are our focusing clusters for video. We have the memory card that we are shooting to, recording to. We have our video resolution settings. Currently, it is at full HD. To set it up, we would press here. It's actually taking us into the menu. And you can see that we have several different options from full HD to crop, 4K, and fine 4K. And we also have the ability to choose different frame rates from 60 frames per second 30 frames per second, or 24 frames per second. We also have IPB and compressed IPB. So sometimes it will not let us shoot certain settings together. In the case of IPB light, you'll notice that we get more recording time versus IPB. The way IPB works, I like to remember it as I like peanut butter. It's a little bit more simple. What the camera does is it analyzes every frame, determines what's changed, and if something hasn't changed, it can reduce the file size through this type of compression and make a very compact video format. The problem with it is sometimes when you get lots of vegetation and fine details, is you start to get artifacts that are splotchy and blocking. Probably more information than you want, but we will cover a lot of this in the crash course, the settings that you choose and why and things of that nature. But this is how you change your video settings. I almost always shoot 4K, 30 frames, IPB. In the case of teaching, for example, I would say okay. And when we come back out, you'll notice that the amount of time that I can record to that 64 gigabyte memory card is much shorter now because I'm recording a much higher resolution. Some other things that we have are digital zoom. I never use it. This is how we can use the camera to zoom in camera. It's all it's doing is magnifying pixels. It's not really increasing our resolution. We have our headset control. If we want to control how loud the volume is where we would do it. Digital Movie IS is digital movie image stabilization. It's using software to remove jitter as we're moving with the camera. Again, it can help if you have nothing else and you're just trying to get the shot, but you can also do it in post, so I don't ever use it. Then we have our white balance, picture styles, creative filters, and the subject detection. So some of these things are the same. There's a couple other things in here. Is you'll notice that we have this little temperature gauge and monitor. That's going to tell us when the camera is overheating and it's time to turn it off. I have not overheated this yet, but my understanding is that if you do lots of video recording, especially outdoors, the camera's going to heat up and you're going to need to shut it down. We also have our start and stop video record button. We have our Q button to jump back into those menus. So I know we have covered a tremendous amount already, just identifying the different icons in short definition of what they do. The good news is, as a photographer, once you get set up, you're really going to be looking at your exposure settings and how your camera is focusing. The rest of these are more secondary tweaks.